David had always considered himself an average guy. He wasn't unattractive, but he certainly didn't expect to match with someone like Hazel. She was stunning, long blonde hair, piercing blue eyes, and a smile that could light up a room. When she swiped right on him, he couldn't believe his luck. Their conversations flowed effortlessly, and it wasn't long before Hazel suggested they meet up. Hazel seemed eager, maybe even a bit too eager, to meet David in person. She invited him to her home, claiming she preferred the intimacy and privacy of her own space over a crowded bar or cafe. David, blinded by excitement and infatuation, agreed without hesitation. Her address led him to a remote part of town, far from the bustling city center. As he drove deeper into the deserted area, unease began to creep in. The houses grew older and fewer in number, and soon he found himself in front of an old, dilapidated house. It looked abandoned, but the lights were on. David knocked on the door, his heart pounding in anticipation. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit hallway. He stepped inside, calling out for Hazel. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind him, and a chilling silence filled the air. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he saw someone standing at the end of the hallway. But it wasn't Hazel. He was a man, tall, gaunt, with a sinister grin that sent shivers down David's spine. Realization hit him like a ton of bricks. He had been catfished. David's instincts screamed at him to run. He turned and bolted towards the door, but the man was fast, too fast. A chase ensued through the old house, with David dodging through rooms and hallways, desperately trying to find an exit. He could hear the man's footsteps close behind, his breath hot on David's neck. At one point, David hid in a closet, holding his breath as the man passed by, muttering to himself. David could see the madness in his eyes through the slats of the closet door. Just when he thought he was safe, the man doubled back, ripping the closet door open and grabbing David. David fought with all his strength, managing to break free and run outside. He jumped into his car, fumbling with the keys in his panic. The man burst through the front door, sprinting towards the car. David started the engine just in time, flooring the gas pedal and speeding down the deserted road. His rearview mirror showed the man chasing him on foot, his speed unnaturally fast. David's heart raced as he swerved around corners, trying to lose his pursuer. At one point, he nearly crashed into a tree, but he managed to regain control. David drove straight to the nearest police station, breathless and terrified. He recounted his harrowing experience, but when the police went to investigate, the house was empty. There was no sign of the man, no evidence of the struggle. It was as if the whole thing had been a bad dream. The police assured David they would keep an eye out, but days turned into weeks with no leads. The man had vanished without a trace, leaving David to grapple with the psychological scars of his encounter. For weeks, David lived in constant fear, looking over his shoulder, jumping at every sound. He couldn't shake the feeling that the man was still out there, watching him, waiting for the right moment to strike again. One evening, David was at home when he heard a faint tapping on his window. His blood ran cold as he recognized the sinister grin of the man outside. Panic surged through him, and he quickly called the police. But by the time they arrived, the man was gone. The police took his report seriously this time, setting up patrols in his neighborhood. David tried to go about his life, but he knew the man was still out there, lurking in the shadows. Days turned into weeks, and David's nerves were constantly on edge. He began noticing small things, footprints in his garden. His trash cans moved, a shadow disappearing around the corner. The man was taunting him, letting him know he was never far away. David's friends urged him to move, to get away from the area, but he felt trapped. He didn't want to uproot his life, and he believed the police would eventually catch the man. But the encounters grew more frequent and more brazen. One night, David was woken by the sound of breaking glass. He rushed to his living room to find the man standing there, a shattered window behind him. The man's grin was wider than ever, his eyes gleaming with madness. David grabbed a nearby lamp and swung it at the man, but he dodged easily, laughing. David ran upstairs, locking himself in his bedroom and barricading the door. He could hear the man downstairs, calmly walking through his house, taunting him. David called the police, his hands shaking so badly he could barely dial. The wait for the sirens felt like an eternity. When they finally arrived, the man was gone, leaving behind a house in disarray and a chilling message scrawled on the wall. "I'm always watching." David couldn't take it anymore. He packed his bags and decided to leave town. But the man was one step ahead. As David loaded his car, he felt a presence behind him. He turned to see the man standing there, holding a knife. David's blood ran cold. He tried to run, but the man was too quick. A struggle ensued, and David was slashed across the arm. He managed to break free and jumped into his car, blood dripping onto the seat as he started the engine. The chase was on again, but this time it was different. The man had a car and was right on David's tail. They sped through the deserted streets, the man's car ramming into David's, trying to force him off the road. David's vision blurred from the blood loss, but he couldn't stop. He pushed his car to the limit, taking sharp turns, trying to lose his pursuer. He could hear the man's maniacal laughter, growing louder and more frenzied. David glanced at his fuel gauge and his heart sank. He was running low on gas. Panic set in as he realized he couldn't keep this up much longer. He saw a chance and took it, turning sharply onto a dirt road that led into the woods. His car bounced and skidded, but he managed to stay ahead. The man's car was right behind him, headlights glaring in the rearview mirror. As the car sputtered and slowed, David knew he had no choice. He slammed on the brakes, jumping out of the car and running into the thick forest. He could hear the man close behind, crashing through the underbrush. David stumbled through the darkness, every rustle of leaves and snap of twigs making his heart race. He saw an old, abandoned cabin up ahead. He ran inside, slamming the door behind him. He found a rusty old shotgun in the cabin, but there were no shells. Desperation clawed at him as he searched for anything to defend himself. The man was close. David could hear his footsteps outside. David hid in the darkness, clutching a broken piece of wood as his only weapon. The door creaked open and the man stepped inside, his eyes gleaming with sadistic pleasure. The final confrontation was brutal. David swung the piece of wood with all his might, striking the man and knocking him to the ground. But the man was relentless, grabbing David's leg and pulling him down. They wrestled on the floor, the man trying to stab David with the knife. David fought with every ounce of strength he had left. He managed to kick the knife out of the man's hand and scrambled to his feet. The man lunged at him, and David swung the wood again, hitting him in the head. The man staggered, but didn't go down. In a final, desperate move, David grabbed a heavy piece of debris and brought it down on the man's head. The man collapsed, unconscious or worse. David didn't wait to find out. He ran from the cabin, adrenaline the only thing keeping him moving. David's escape through the woods was a nightmare. He was weak from blood loss, disoriented, and terrified the man would wake up and come after him again. He stumbled through the darkness, every rustle of leaves and snap of twigs making his heart race. Hours later, he emerged on the other side of the woods, collapsing on the road. A passing car found him and took him to the hospital. He was barely conscious, muttering about the man and the nightmare he had lived through. David woke up in the hospital, bandaged and weak. The police were there, eager to hear his story. They went back to the cabin, but the man was gone. There was no sign of him, no trace he had ever been there. David knew he had to get far away. He moved to a different city, changed his name, and tried to start over. But the psychological scars remained. He lived in constant fear, always looking over his shoulder, always waiting for the day the man would find him again. He knew he would carry the terror of that night with him for the rest of his life. David's story is a chilling reminder of the dangers that can lurk behind a seemingly innocent online profile. Always be cautious when meeting someone new, especially if it seems too good to be true.
Next story.
Ariana had always prided herself on her caution. Growing up in the suburbs of Seattle, she learned to navigate the world with a healthy mix of curiosity and wariness. She lived alone in a small apartment, balancing her time between work at a local marketing firm and her passion for photography. One day, while browsing Craigslist for vintage camera equipment, she stumbled upon an ad that caught her eye. Vintage Rolleiflex camera, excellent condition, $50. The price was astonishingly low for such a rare and valuable camera. Ariana's pulse quickened with excitement. She clicked on the ad and scrutinized the details. The camera appeared to be in perfect condition, and the brief description was accompanied by a single photograph that showed a pristine Rolleiflex. The seller, who went by the name Charles, had left an email address for contact. Without hesitating, Ariana composed a quick email expressing her interest in the camera. She mentioned her love for photography and asked if she could see the camera in person. Moments later, a reply landed in her inbox. "Hi Ariana. I'm glad you're interested in the Rolleiflex. I'm moving out of state soon and need to sell a few items quickly. Could you come by tomorrow evening to take a look? My address is 3426 Maple Street. Best, Charles." Ariana paused for a moment, a slight unease creeping into her thoughts. But the opportunity to own a Rolleiflex was too tempting. She quickly responded, agreeing to meet at 7 p.m. the next evening. The next day passed in a blur of anticipation. As the evening approached, a strange sense of dread settled in her stomach. She tried to shake it off, attributing it to nerves and excitement. At 6:45 p.m., she left her apartment and drove to Maple Street, arriving just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The neighborhood was quiet and well-maintained, with manicured lawns and tidy flower beds. Ariana parked her car in front of 3426 Maple Street, an older Victorian house that stood out among the more modern homes. The house had an air of faded grandeur, its paint slightly peeling and windows dimly lit. Ariana walked up the creaky wooden steps to the front door and rang the bell. After a moment, the door opened to reveal a man in his late 40s. He had a warm smile, but there was something unsettling about his eyes. They seemed too cold, too calculating. "You must be Ariana," he said, stepping aside to let her in. "I'm Charles. Come in. The camera is in the living room." The house was dimly lit and smelled faintly of mildew. Ariana's unease grew, but she followed Charles into the living room. The walls were lined with bookshelves filled with old, dusty volumes and various knick-knacks. In the center of the room, on a small table, sat the Rolleiflex. "It's beautiful," Ariana said, picking up the camera. She examined it closely, her excitement momentarily overshadowing her discomfort. The camera was in perfect condition, just as the ad had promised. Charles watched her intently. "Do you like it?" he asked. "Yes, very much," Ariana replied, forcing a smile. "I'd like to buy it." "Great," Charles said, his smile widening. "But before you go, would you like something to drink? I have some homemade lemonade in the kitchen." Ariana's instincts screamed at her to decline, but she didn't want to seem rude. Sure, that sounds nice, she said reluctantly. Charles led her into the kitchen, which was even darker and more oppressive than the living room. He poured her a glass of lemonade and handed it to her. Ariana took a cautious sip. It tasted slightly off, but she forced another smile. So, why are you selling the camera? She asked, trying to make conversation. Charles leaned against the counter, his eyes never leaving her. Just trying to declutter before I move. Too many memories tied to that camera. Ariana felt a chill run down her spine. She took another sip of the lemonade, but this time she noticed a strange, bitter aftertaste. Her vision began to blur, and her limbs felt heavy. What's happening to me? She managed to slur, her voice thick with panic. Charles's smile turned sinister. Just a little something to help you relax. You seemed so tense. Ariana's heart pounded in her chest as she realized she had been drugged. She tried to stand, but her legs gave out beneath her. Charles caught her before she hit the floor. Don't worry, Ariana, he whispered in her ear. This will all be over soon. Her vision went black, and the last thing she heard was the sound of Charles's chilling laughter. When Ariana awoke, she was lying on a cold, hard surface. Her head throbbed and her mouth was dry. She tried to move, but her wrists and ankles were bound with thick ropes. Panic surged through her as she struggled against her restraints. The room was dark, the only light coming from a small, barred window high up on the wall. She could hear the distant sound of water dripping and the occasional scurry of rats. She realized with horror that she was in a basement. A door creaked open, and Charles descended the stairs, carrying a tray with a bowl of soup and a bottle of water. He set the tray down next to her and knelt beside her, his face inches from hers. How are you feeling? He asked, his voice dripping with false concern. Let me go, Ariana pleaded, her voice hoarse. Please, let me go. Charles shook his head slowly. I'm afraid I can't do that, Ariana. You see, I've been looking for someone like you for a long time. Someone who appreciates the finer things in life. Ariana's mind raced as she tried to think of a way to escape. She knew she had to stay calm and buy herself some time. Why are you doing this? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Charles stood up and began pacing the room. Because I'm an artist, Ariana. And you, my dear, are going to be my masterpiece. He walked over to a table in the corner of the room and picked up a large, leather-bound book. He opened it and began flipping through the pages, occasionally glancing up at her. This is my portfolio, he explained. Photographs of all my previous subjects. Each one unique, each one beautiful in their own way. Ariana's blood ran cold as she realized what he was saying. He was a killer, and she was his next victim. You don't have to do this, she said desperately. I won't tell anyone, I promise. Charles closed the book and set it back on the table. It's too late for that, Ariana. But don't worry, I'll make sure your final moments are captured perfectly. He left the room, leaving Ariana alone with her thoughts. She knew she had to find a way to escape, but her mind was foggy from the drugs and her body felt weak. She tugged at the ropes binding her wrists, but they were too tight. Hours passed, or maybe it was only minutes. Ariana couldn't tell. The basement door opened again and Charles returned, this time carrying a camera. Smile for the camera, he said, his voice filled with a sickening glee. Ariana's heart pounded in her chest as the flash went off, momentarily blinding her. She knew she had to act fast. Summoning all her strength, she twisted her wrists, ignoring the pain as the ropes cut into her skin. Finally, one of her hands slipped free. She waited until Charles was focused on adjusting the camera settings before making her move. With a burst of adrenaline, she lunged at him, knocking the camera out of his hands. It shattered on the floor, the pieces scattering across the room. Charles roared in anger and grabbed her by the hair, dragging her back to the center of the room. But Ariana fought back, kicking and scratching, determined not to give up. In the struggle, she managed to free her other hand and grabbed a shard of broken glass from the floor. She slashed at Charles's arm, causing him to howl in pain and release his grip on her. Ariana scrambled to her feet and ran for the stairs, her heart pounding in her chest. She could hear Charles behind her, his footsteps echoing off the walls. She reached the top of the stairs and threw open the door, racing through the house. She burst out the front door and into the night, the cool air hitting her like a shock. She ran down the street, her bare feet slapping against the pavement, not daring to look back. Finally, she spotted a house with lights on and pounded on the door, screaming for help. A middle-aged couple opened the door, their eyes wide with shock. "Please, help me," Ariana cried. "He's trying to kill me." They pulled her inside and called the police. Ariana collapsed on the floor, her body shaking with sobs. She had escaped, but she knew she would never be the same. The police arrived within minutes and stormed Charles's house. Ariana waited, trembling and clinging to the couple who had let her in. After what felt like an eternity, an officer emerged from the house, his expression grim. "We didn't find him," he said. "What?" Ariana's voice was barely more than a whisper. "But he was right behind me." "We searched the entire house," the officer explained. "But there's no sign of Charles. However, we did find something in the basement." Ariana's heart sank. She followed the officer back to the house, her legs feeling like they could give out at any moment. The basement was just as she had left it, except for one detail. In the center of the floor, where the broken camera had been, was a small, smiley-faced fidget spinner. The officer bent down to pick it up, his face pale. "This is bad. Very bad." "What do you mean?" Ariana asked, her voice trembling. He looked at her with a mixture of sympathy and fear. "This is the calling card of a notorious serial killer we've been trying to catch for years. He leaves these smiley-faced fidget spinners at every crime scene. You're incredibly lucky to be alive. None of his other victims ever survived." Ariana felt the room spin. She had narrowly escaped a monster. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "We start a manhunt," the officer said. "We'll need to keep you safe. He might come back for you." In the days that followed, Ariana tried to return to some semblance of normalcy, but the fear never left her. The police provided her with protection, but it did little to ease her anxiety. Every creak of her apartment, every shadow cast by the streetlights outside, made her jump. She found some solace in her photography, wandering the city with her camera. She tried to capture moments of beauty to distract herself from the terror that lurked in her mind. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw Charles's face, his cold smile, and heard the haunting click of the camera. One evening, she returned home to find a note slipped under her door. Her hand shook as she picked it up and read the chilling words, "I'll be seeing you soon." Ariana's blood ran cold. She called the police immediately, but by the time they arrived, the note had vanished. They searched her apartment and found no signs of forced entry. The officer in charge, Detective Miller, looked at her with a mixture of concern and frustration. "We'll increase patrols around your building," he said. "But you need to be vigilant. Don't go anywhere alone, and keep your doors locked at all times." Despite their efforts, Ariana felt a growing sense of dread. She couldn't shake the feeling that Charles was watching her, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. She began to have nightmares, waking up in a cold sweat, convinced he was in her room. One particularly stormy night, Ariana sat in her living room, trying to distract herself with a book. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, and the rain pounded against the roof. Suddenly, she heard a noise, a faint, rhythmic clicking sound. Her heart raced as she strained to hear it. It was the sound of a camera shutter. Ariana's blood ran cold. She grabbed her phone and dialed 911, but the call wouldn't go through. The line was dead. She backed away from the windows, her eyes darting around the room. The clicking sound grew louder, closer. She realized with horror that the sound was coming from inside the house. Ariana grabbed a kitchen knife and moved toward the hallway, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She reached the hallway and saw a figure standing at the end, shrouded in darkness. Charles. His smile was as cold and calculating as ever. He held up a camera and took another picture, the flash momentarily blinding her. "Hello, Ariana," he said, his voice smooth and menacing. "Did you miss me?" Ariana didn't waste a second. She turned and ran, sprinting down the hallway and into her bedroom. She slammed the door shut and locked it, her heart pounding in her chest. She could hear Charles's footsteps approaching, slow and deliberate. She searched the room for a way out. The window. She ran to it and struggled to open it, but it was stuck. Charles's footsteps grew closer, and she could hear him talking to her through the door. "You can't hide from me, Ariana. You belong to me now. You're my masterpiece." She finally managed to wrench the window open and climbed out onto the fire escape. The cold rain lashed against her skin as she descended the metal steps as quickly as she could. She could hear Charles behind her, his laughter echoing in the night. She reached the ground and ran into the alley, her bare feet splashing through puddles. She didn't dare look back. She needed to find help. She burst out of the alley and onto the street, waving frantically at passing cars. A car screeched to a halt, and the driver rolled down the window. "Are you okay?" a woman asked, her eyes wide with concern. "Please, help me," Ariana cried. "He's trying to kill me." The woman unlocked the doors, and Ariana climbed in, her body shaking with fear. "Call the police," she said, her voice trembling. "He's after me." The woman drove away from the scene and pulled out her phone, calling 911. Ariana glanced out the back window, half expecting to see Charles following them. But the street was empty. The police met them at a nearby station, and Ariana was taken inside to speak with Detective Miller. She recounted everything that had happened, her voice breaking as she described Charles's return. "We'll find him," Miller said, his expression determined. "We won't let him get away this time." Despite his assurances, Ariana couldn't shake the feeling of impending doom. She stayed with a friend for a few nights, too afraid to return to her own apartment. The police increased their patrols, but Charles remained elusive. One night, Ariana's friend suggested they try to relax and watch a movie. They settled on the couch with a bowl of popcorn, trying to lose themselves in the film. But halfway through, Ariana's phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at the screen and felt her blood turn to ice. The message was from an unknown number, and it contained a single photograph, a picture of her and her friend sitting on the couch, taken from outside the window. "We're not safe here," Ariana whispered, showing the message to her friend. "We need to leave. Now." They hurriedly packed a bag and drove to the police station. Detective Miller arranged for them to stay in a safe house, guarded around the clock. But even there, Ariana couldn't escape the feeling that Charles was watching her, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Days turned into weeks, and the manhunt continued with no sign of Charles. Ariana lived in a constant state of fear, jumping at every noise, unable to sleep. She knew she couldn't live like this forever. One evening, as the sun set over the city, Ariana sat in the safe house, staring out the window. She felt a strange sense of calm wash over her. a realization that she couldn't keep running forever. She needed to confront her fear head-on. She turned to Detective Miller, who was sitting at the table, going over case files. "I want to help you catch him," she said, her voice steady. Miller looked up, surprised. "Ariana, it's too dangerous. We can't risk your safety." "I can't keep living like this," she said, her resolve firm. "I know him. I know how he thinks. I can help you find him." Miller hesitated, then nodded. "All right, but we do this by the book. No unnecessary risks." They devised a plan to lure Charles out of hiding. Ariana would return to her apartment, with undercover officers stationed nearby. They would set up cameras and surveillance equipment, hoping to catch Charles when he inevitably returned. The first night back in her apartment was tense. Ariana felt like a mouse in a trap, waiting for the cat to pounce. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, every creak and groan of the building amplified in her mind. Hours passed, and just as she began to drift off, she heard the faint, unmistakable click of a camera shutter. Her heart leaped into her throat. She sat up, straining to hear. She grabbed her phone and sent a quick text to Detective Miller. "He's here." Within moments, the undercover officers moved into action. They surrounded the building, closing in on Charles. Ariana could hear the commotion outside her door, the sound of footsteps and shouted commands. Suddenly, the door burst open and Charles stood there, his smile as chilling as ever. "Hello again, Ariana," he said, raising his camera. Before he could take another step, the officers tackled him to the ground, wresting the camera from his hands. Charles fought back, but he was quickly subdued and handcuffed. Ariana watched, her breath coming in ragged gasps as they hauled him away. She felt a strange mix of relief and fear, knowing that while he was finally caught, the trauma he had inflicted would never fully disappear. Detective Miller approached her, his expression one of cautious relief. "We got him," he said. "You're safe now." Ariana nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered. In the months that followed, Ariana worked to rebuild her life. She continued her therapy, finding strength in her photography and the support of her friends. She knew she would never forget the terror she had endured, but she also knew she was stronger for having survived it. Charles was brought to trial, his crimes laid bare for the world to see. Ariana testified against him, her voice steady and unwavering. She looked him in the eye, refusing to be intimidated, and told the court everything he had done. In the end, Charles was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. Ariana felt a sense of closure, knowing he would never hurt anyone again. But she also knew that the scars he had left would always be a part of her. Despite the darkness she had faced, Ariana found a new appreciation for life. She continued to capture moments of beauty through her lens, finding solace in the art that had once brought her so much joy. And though the fear never fully disappeared, she learned to live with it, to embrace the strength that had carried her through the darkest of times. She knew that she would always carry the memory of Charles with her, but she also knew that she was a survivor. And no matter what the future held, she would face it with courage and resilience. If you enjoyed this spine-chilling tale, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. More mysteries await. Stay safe and stay tuned.
Next story.
It was a chilly autumn evening, and Madison was finishing up her night shift at the quaint little coffee shop. The clock struck 11 p.m., and she started her closing routine, humming softly to herself as she cleaned the counters and arranged the chairs. The warmth of the shop contrasted sharply with the cold wind howling outside, but Madison felt a strange unease she couldn't quite shake off. Madison had always been cautious, especially during her night shifts, but tonight felt different. After flipping the sign to closed, she turned back to her cleaning, only to notice a tall, built man standing just outside the door. His eyes were fixed on her with an intensity that sent chills down her spine. "Sorry, we're closed," she said with a nervous smile, hoping he would take the hint and leave. But the man just stood there, staring. Trying to maintain her composure, Madison continued with her tasks, her heart pounding in her chest. She suddenly realized that in her haste to put up the closed sign, she had forgotten to lock the door. Panic gripped her, but she forced herself to stay calm. She discreetly grabbed her phone from behind the counter and texted her boyfriend, Jake, explaining the situation. Jake texted back, "On my way. Keep a knife close and keep an eye on him. Don't worry, I'll be there soon." Madison's relief was short-lived. She glanced back at the door to find the man gone. Quickly, she ran to the door and locked it, laughing nervously at her overreaction. She texted Jake to let him know the man had left and that she was fine, but Jake insisted on coming to pick her up. "Really, Jake, I'm fine," she assured him. "I'll just finish up and head home. We can catch up on the weekend." Jake reluctantly agreed but decided to keep driving towards the coffee shop, his instincts telling him something wasn't right. Madison continued her cleaning, moving to the bathroom to finish up. As she scrubbed the sinks, she heard footsteps echoing in the empty shop. Her heart raced. She gripped tightly onto the mop, listening intently. The footsteps stopped, and in the reflection of the bathroom's glass, she saw the man, crouching and hiding. Panicking, she slammed the bathroom door shut and locked it, realizing her phone was still on the kitchen counter. Trapped and terrified, Madison prayed that Jake would arrive soon. After what felt like an eternity, she heard Jake's voice calling out her name. She opened the door cautiously and ran into his arms. They left the shop quickly, heading to Jake's apartment. Madison stayed at Jake's place for the next few weeks. Life slowly returned to normal, and the horrifying encounter at the coffee shop began to feel like a distant nightmare. But Madison couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, a lingering unease that followed her everywhere. One evening, after returning to her own apartment, Madison decided to relax and watch a movie on her laptop. She had just changed into her sleeping clothes and settled into bed when she heard the faint creak of a floorboard downstairs. Her blood ran cold. Moving swiftly but silently, she locked her bedroom door and texted Jake, her hands trembling. When he didn't respond, she dialed 911. To her horror, her phone's battery died mid-call, and the charger was in the other room. Desperate, she picked up the landline phone on her desk. As she dialed 911 again, the line went dead and the lights flickered out. Panic surged through her. The man had cut off the electricity. Complete silence enveloped the room. Madison hid in the closet, peeking through the slats to watch the room. Her body shook with fear. She strained to hear any sound, but there was nothing. Suddenly, she heard a faint tapping on the window. Turning slowly, her heart nearly stopped as she saw the man outside, smiling. He shattered the glass with his crowbar. Madison screamed and bolted for the front door, the man hot on her heels. Just as she reached the door, Jake's car screeched to a halt outside. He jumped out, enraged, wielding a baseball bat. He struck the man on the head and began beating him mercilessly. Jake tied the unconscious man with the ropes he had brought and called the cops. When the police arrived, they searched the man's pockets and found a pair of dice. The officers exchanged knowing glances. This was the clue left at every crime scene by a notorious serial killer with 37 female victims, known for never leaving any other trace. As the police took the man away, Madison clung to Jake, tears streaming down her face. The nightmare was over. but the scars it left would remain with her forever. Weeks later, Madison and Jake sat in a police station, reviewing security footage from the night of the coffee shop incident. The footage showed the man picking the lock, placing duct tape and ropes on the counter, and moving towards the bathroom with a crowbar in hand. The sight sent shivers down Madison's spine. Despite the ordeal, Madison knew she was lucky to be alive. She had Jake to thank for that, and together they would move forward, forever changed but stronger for having faced the darkness together.
Next story.
Sophia glanced at her watch as she hurried out of the office. It was past midnight, and the streets were eerily quiet. The shadows cast by the dim streetlights seemed to stretch and morph, playing tricks on her tired eyes. She pulled her coat tighter around her, the chill of the night air creeping into her bones. With a sigh, she spotted a taxi idling by the curb. Relieved, she waved it down. The driver, a middle-aged man with a kind smile and glasses perched on the tip of his nose, nodded and gestured for her to get in. "Where to?" he asked, his voice calm and reassuring. Sophia gave him her address and settled into the back seat, feeling a sense of safety wash over her. The car began to move, the hum of the engine blending with the distant sounds of the city that never sleeps. She leaned her head against the window, closing her eyes for a moment. After a few minutes, she felt the car take a turn down a narrow alley. Sophia opened her eyes and looked around, unfamiliar with the route. She leaned forward. "Excuse me, I think you took a wrong turn. My place is the other way." The driver glanced at her through the rearview mirror, his eyes catching the dim light in a way that made her skin crawl. His kind smile was gone, replaced by a chilling blankness. "Don't worry," he said, his voice now devoid of the earlier warmth. "We'll get there." A knot of anxiety tightened in Sophia's stomach. She tried to stay calm, telling herself it was just a misunderstanding. But as the alley grew narrower and the surroundings more desolate, her heart pounded louder in her chest. "Please, turn around. This isn't the right way," she insisted, her voice trembling. The driver ignored her, his grip on the steering wheel tightening. Panic surged through Sophia. She reached for her phone, but as she did, the driver slammed on the brakes, causing her to lurch forward. "Hand it over," he commanded, his voice now a low, threatening growl. Sophia clutched her phone, her eyes wide with fear. The driver turned around, a sinister smile spreading across his face. "Now," he demanded, his tone leaving no room for defiance. With shaking hands, she handed the phone over, watching helplessly as he tossed it out the window into the darkness. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The driver chuckled, a sound that sent shivers down her spine. "You'll find out soon enough." The car began to move again, faster this time. Sophia's mind raced, desperately searching for a way out. She tried the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. Locked. She was trapped. The car came to an abrupt stop in front of an abandoned warehouse. The driver got out, walking around to open her door. Sophia's instincts screamed at her to run, but her legs felt like lead. He yanked her out of the car, his grip bruising her arm. "Let's go," he ordered, dragging her toward the warehouse. Sophia struggled, tears streaming down her face. She had to get away. As they neared the entrance, she mustered all her strength and kicked him in the shin. He howled in pain, loosening his grip just enough for her to break free. She ran, her breath coming in ragged gasps, the sound of his footsteps pounding behind her. She darted into the warehouse, her eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering through broken windows. She hid behind a stack of crates, her heart thundering in her chest. The driver entered, his footsteps echoing in the vast, empty space. "You can't hide forever," he taunted, his voice dripping with malice. Sophia stifled a sob, trying to remain as silent as possible. She peeked around the crates, watching him as he searched for her, the darkness adding an extra layer of terror to her ordeal. Her mind raced. She needed a plan. She spotted a rusty metal rod lying nearby. Quietly, she reached for it, her hand shaking. The driver was getting closer, his silhouette looming larger with each step. She held her breath, waiting for the right moment. As he rounded the corner, she swung the rod with all her might. It connected with his arm, and he staggered back, cursing. Sophia didn't wait to see the damage. She ran, her footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. She saw a staircase leading to a loft and sprinted toward it, taking the steps 2 at a time. At the top, she found a small room with a single window. Sophia yanked the window open and climbed out onto the ledge. She looked down, the ground seeming impossibly far away. The driver lunged at her, grabbing her ankle. She kicked wildly, her heel connecting with his face. He let go, and she lost her balance, falling from the ledge. She hit the ground hard, pain exploding through her body. She lay there, gasping, as the driver stared down at her from the window, his face twisted with rage. With a Herculean effort, she got to her feet and stumbled toward the street. She could hear him coming after her, his footsteps growing louder. Just as she thought she couldn't go any further, a pair of headlights appeared in the distance. She waved frantically, screaming for help. The car screeched to a halt, and the driver jumped out, a look of shock on his face. "Are you okay? What happened?" he asked, helping her into the car. "Drive. Please, just drive," she cried, her voice breaking. As the car sped away, Sophia looked back to see the sinister driver standing in the middle of the road, his face illuminated by the taillights. His eyes bore into hers, a silent promise that this wasn't over. The new driver took her to the nearest police station, where she recounted her harrowing ordeal. The officers sprang into action, but when they returned to the warehouse, it was empty. The man had vanished, leaving no trace. Days turned into weeks, and Sophia tried to rebuild her life, though the fear never left her. She couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching, waiting. She moved to a new apartment, changed her routines, and tried to stay vigilant. One evening, as she returned home from work, she found a note slipped under her door. Her blood ran cold as she read the words scrawled in a chilling handwriting. "I'll be seeing you soon." Sophia's world tilted as she realized her nightmare was far from over. The hunter was still out there, and she was still his prey. The fear gnawed at her every waking moment. She began to see shadows where there were none, hear footsteps in the silence of the night. She installed multiple locks on her doors, double-checked the windows, and kept a knife under her pillow. Sleep was a luxury she could no longer afford. One particularly dark and stormy night, the electricity went out. Sophia's apartment was plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the occasional flash of lightning. She sat on her bed, clutching the knife, her heart racing with every creak and groan of the old building. Suddenly, she heard a noise of faint tapping at her window. Her breath caught in her throat as she slowly turned to look. There, illuminated by the next flash of lightning, was the face of the driver, pressed against the glass, his eyes gleaming with malevolent glee. Sophia screamed, stumbling back and falling off the bed. She scrambled to her feet and ran to the door, her hands fumbling with the locks. The tapping turned into pounding, the glass rattling under the force. Just as she managed to unlock the door, the window shattered. The driver climbed in, his movements slow and deliberate, like a predator toying with its prey. Sophia dashed out of the apartment, her bare feet slapping against the cold, hard floor of the hallway. She ran down the stairs, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She could hear him behind her, his footsteps unnervingly calm and measured. Reaching the ground floor, she burst out into the rain-soaked street, the cold water drenching her almost instantly. Sophia looked around, desperate for help, but the streets were deserted. She ran down the block, her mind racing for a plan. She spotted a small convenience store, its lights flickering ominously. She sprinted toward it, praying it was open. She reached the door and yanked it open, the bell above it jingling. The clerk looked up, startled, as Sophia stumbled in, soaking wet and trembling. "Please, help me. Call the police," she cried, her voice raw with desperation. The clerk reached for the phone, but before he could dial, the driver appeared in the doorway. He smiled at Sophia, a smile that sent waves of terror crashing over her. "She's with me," he said calmly, his eyes locked onto hers. The clerk hesitated, glancing between Sophia and the driver. Sophia shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No, he's lying. Please, call the police." The driver took a step forward, and the clerk, clearly terrified, dropped the phone and backed away. Sophia's heart sank. She was on her own. Summoning every ounce of courage, she grabbed a can from the nearest shelf and threw it at the driver. It hit him square in the chest, and he snarled, lunging at her. She darted around the aisles, knocking over displays in a desperate attempt to slow him down. She reached the back of the store and found an emergency exit. She shoved it open and ran into the alley behind the store, the cold night air hitting her like a slap. She didn't stop running. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to keep moving. She rounded a corner and saw a police car parked at a diner. Relief washed over her as she ran toward it, banging on the window. "Help me! Please, help me!" she cried, her voice barely above a whisper. The officer inside looked up, startled, and quickly got out of the car. "What's going on?" Sophia pointed back down the alley, her whole body shaking. "He's after me. Please, you have to help me." The officer glanced down the alley and saw the driver emerging, his face twisted with anger. He immediately called for backup and stood between Sophia and the driver, his hand on his holstered gun. The driver stopped, his eyes boring into Sophia's. "This isn't over," he hissed before turning and disappearing into the night. Backup arrived, and the officers took Sophia to the station, where she recounted her ordeal once again. This time, they took her seriously. They promised to find the man and keep her safe. Weeks passed, and though the driver was never caught, Sophia tried to move on with her life. She found a new apartment in a different part of the city, changed her phone number, and did everything she could to erase her old life. But the fear never left her. She knew he was still out there, watching, waiting for the right moment. Every time she left her apartment, she looked over her shoulder, her heart pounding with dread. One night, as she was getting ready for bed, she received a text from an unknown number. Her blood ran cold as she read the message, "I'll always find you." Sophia stared at the screen, her heart hammering in her chest. She knew that no matter where she went, no matter how far she ran, the nightmare would never truly be over. The hunter was still out there, and she would always be his prey. Sophia resolved to fight back. She started taking self-defense classes, learning how to protect herself. She joined a support group for victims of stalking, finding solace in the shared experiences of others. She installed a security system in her apartment, complete with cameras and alarms. Months turned into years, and slowly, the fear began to fade. She built a new life for herself, surrounded by friends and a supportive community. She even found the courage to start dating again, though the scars of her past never fully healed. One evening, as she was closing up at her new job, she received a call. The voice on the other end was low and distorted, but the words sent a chill through her entire being. "I told you I'd be seeing you soon." Sophia's heart stopped. She dropped the phone, her hand shaking uncontrollably. She looked around, the walls of her new life closing in on her. He had found her again. The nightmare was far from over. As she left the building, she felt a presence watching her. She turned, scanning the shadows, but saw nothing. Her mind screamed at her to run, to find safety. But deep down, she knew there was no escaping him. The driver was a shadow that would haunt her forever, a relentless hunter who thrived on her fear. Sophia fled into the night, the darkness swallowing her up. The rain began to fall again, each drop a reminder of that fateful night when her life was forever changed. She ran, her footsteps echoing in the empty streets, her heart pounding with a terror that would never fade. And somewhere in the depths of the shadows, the driver watched, his eyes gleaming with a cold, unyielding determination. The hunt had begun once more, and this time he would not let her escape. As Sophia disappeared into the night, a shiver ran down her spine, knowing that despite her resilience, the specter of her tormentor still loomed. The hunt had resumed, casting a long shadow over her newfound sense of peace. If you found this story gripping, consider subscribing for more chilling tales like Sophia's.
Next story.
Riley had heard the rumors about Shadowland, the abandoned theme park on the outskirts of town. It had been closed for over a decade after a series of mysterious accidents, and whispers of the paranormal had kept most people away. But Riley, a curious and daring 16-year-old, was not like most people. With her flashlight in hand and her heart pounding with excitement and fear, she decided to explore the park under the cover of night. The entrance loomed ahead, the once vibrant colors now faded and peeling. As Riley stepped through the rusted gates, a chill ran down her spine. The wind howled through the empty attractions, creating an eerie symphony that echoed in the darkness. She walked past the dilapidated ticket booths and into the heart of the park, her footsteps the only sound in the silence. She ventured towards the Ferris wheel, its skeletal frame towering over her like a giant sentinel. The creaking of its rusted metal sounded like a mournful wail. As she moved closer, a sense of unease settled over her. The park was more than just abandoned. It felt wrong. The air was thick with a palpable sense of dread, as if the very ground beneath her feet was soaked with the memories of a forgotten nightmare. Riley's flashlight beam swept over the decrepit rides and faded signs, revealing glimpses of a once bustling paradise now swallowed by decay. She reached the carousel, the horses frozen in mid-gallop, their painted eyes staring blankly into the void. The eerie silence was suddenly broken by a faint, almost imperceptible whisper. Riley's heart skipped a beat as she strained to listen, but the sound was gone as quickly as it had appeared. Determined to uncover the secrets of Shadowland, she continued her exploration. The further she ventured, the more unsettling the atmosphere became. She found herself at the entrance of the haunted house, its facade cracked and weathered. With a deep breath, she pushed open the creaking door and stepped inside. The darkness inside the haunted house was suffocating, swallowing her flashlight beam and amplifying the creaks and groans of the old building. As Riley navigated the narrow corridors, she felt an oppressive weight pressing down on her. Shadows seemed to move just out of the corner of her eye, and the air was thick with the scent of mildew and decay. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the halls, causing Riley to jump. She whipped her flashlight around, its beam dancing across the walls. Her pulse quickened as she realized she was not alone. Footsteps echoed behind her, slow and deliberate. Panic surged through her veins as she broke into a run, her footsteps echoing in the narrow corridor. She rounded a corner and stumbled into a room filled with old props and mannequins dressed in tattered costumes. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Riley ducked behind a stack of crates, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She peeked through a crack between the boxes and saw a shadowy figure moving through the room, searching. The figure's movements were deliberate, almost methodical, as if they were hunting her. Riley's mind raced. Who is this person? Why were they here? She had to get out, but the exits were far and the figure was too close. She waited until the figure moved to the other side of the room, then slipped out from her hiding place and crept towards the door. Every creak of the floorboards seemed deafening in the silence. Just as she reached the door, it swung open with a violent crash. The sinister man stood in the doorway, his eyes glinting with malevolent intent. Riley's blood ran cold as she recognized him from the news, a dangerous criminal who had escaped from a nearby prison months ago. The man lunged at her, and she darted past him, sprinting down the corridor with adrenaline-fueled speed. Riley burst out of the haunted house and into the open air, but the relief was short-lived. The man was right behind her, relentless in his pursuit. She dodged between the rides, her lungs burning and her legs aching. The park had become a nightmarish maze, and she was the prey in a deadly game of cat and mouse. She spotted a maintenance shed and dashed inside, slamming the door shut and locking it. She pressed her back against the wall, her heart hammering in her chest. The shed was filled with old tools and equipment, offering little in the way of defense. Riley's eyes scanned the room, and she grabbed a rusty crowbar, clutching it tightly. Outside, the footsteps grew louder, then stopped. Silence. Riley held her breath, straining to hear. The door handle rattled, then stopped. She heard the sound of something being dragged against the wall, followed by a series of heavy thuds. The man was trying to break in. Riley's mind raced. She couldn't stay here. She had to find a way out. She noticed a small window near the ceiling and scrambled towards it, using a stack of crates to reach it. She pried it open and squeezed through, dropping to the ground outside with a muffled thud. She took off running again, her lungs burning with every breath. She reached the edge of the park, the gates looming ahead. Just as she thought she was free, the man tackled her from behind, sending them both crashing to the ground. Riley fought with all her strength, struggling to break free. She managed to slip away and run. She didn't stop until she reached her neighborhood, her body trembling with exhaustion and fear. She stumbled up the steps of her house and banged on the door. Her parents opened it, their faces pale with worry. Riley collapsed into their arms, sobbing uncontrollably. But the nightmare was far from over. As the police arrived and took her statement, Riley glanced out the window and saw a shadowy figure standing at the edge of the yard, watching her. The sinister man had followed her home. A chilling realization settled over her. The game was not over. It had only just begun. The following days were a blur of anxiety and fear. Riley's parents installed security cameras and new locks, but the sense of unease lingered. She couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, and every creak and shadow in the house set her nerves on edge. One night, as she lay in bed, she heard a faint tapping on her window. Her heart raced as she peered through the curtains, but saw nothing. She tried to convince herself it was just a branch in the wind, but deep down, she knew better. The man was still out there, waiting for the right moment. Riley resolved to stay vigilant, but exhaustion soon took its toll. She fell into a restless sleep, plagued by nightmares of Shadowland and the sinister man. In the dead of night, she was jolted awake by a loud crash. Her bedroom window shattered, and the man climbed through, his eyes gleaming with malicious intent. Panic seized her, but she forced herself to move. She grabbed her phone and dialed 911, but the call wouldn't go through. The man advanced towards her, and she threw the phone at him, buying herself a few precious seconds to escape. She bolted down the hallway, her mind racing with terror. She reached the living room and grabbed a baseball bat her father kept for protection. The man followed, moving with a predatory grace. Riley swung the bat, but he caught it and yanked it from her hands. She stumbled back, her foot catching on the rug, and fell to the floor. Just as the man loomed over her, a deafening roar filled the room. Her father tackled the man, wrestling him to the ground. Riley scrambled to her feet and ran to call the police. She returned to find her father struggling with the man, who had managed to get the upper hand. With a primal scream, Riley lunged at the man, causing him to back off just enough for her father to regain control. The police arrived moments later, bursting through the door and taking the man into custody. As the officers led the man away, Riley felt a sense of relief wash over her. The nightmare was finally over, but as she watched the man being driven away, his eyes met hers, and a chilling smile spread across his face. Riley knew that while he was behind bars, the memory of Shadowland and the terror he had caused would haunt her forever.
Next story.
Amanda checked her phone for the 100th time that night, scrolling through memes and half-reading articles about celebrity gossip. As an 18-year-old pizza delivery driver, her nights often dragged on in a monotonous routine. The clock on the wall of the pizza place showed 11:45 p.m., almost closing time. She sighed and started wiping down the counter, eager to finish her shift and head home. Just then, the phone rang. Startled, Amanda answered, her voice steady and professional despite her weariness. "Hello, how can I help you?" A deep, gravelly voice responded. "I'd like to place an order for delivery. Large pepperoni, extra cheese. Address is 13 Ravenwood Lane." Amanda frowned. Ravenwood Lane? She had never heard of it. She quickly typed the address into her GPS. "It's pretty far out," she noted. "Are you sure?" "Yes," the voice insisted. "I'll give a good tip." Reluctantly, Amanda agreed. The potential tip persuaded her. She hung up, grabbed the freshly made pizza, and headed out into the cool night air. The streets were eerily quiet, and as Amanda drove further from town, the streetlights became fewer and farther between. Her GPS led her down a winding, narrow road surrounded by dense woods. The moonlight barely penetrated the canopy of leaves above, casting long shadows that seemed to dance in her headlights. As she approached Ravenwood Lane, her unease grew. The houses were sparse, old, and dilapidated. Finally, she spotted the number 13 on a rusty mailbox. The house itself was almost hidden by overgrown bushes and trees, its dark windows staring at her like empty eye sockets. She parked the car, took a deep breath, and walked to the door, pizza in hand. Amanda knocked. The door creaked open slightly, revealing a sliver of darkness inside. "Hello? Pizza delivery," she called out. No response. She knocked again, louder this time. The door swung open with a loud creak, revealing a dimly lit hallway. Hesitant but determined, Amanda stepped inside. Suddenly, a rough hand grabbed her from behind, covering her mouth. She tried to scream, but the sound was muffled. She struggled, kicking and writhing, but her assailant was too strong. He dragged her into the house and slammed the door shut. Amanda woke up in a dark, damp basement, her head throbbing. She was tied to a chair, her wrists and ankles bound tightly with rope. The air was cold and smelled of mold. She could hear faint, desperate whimpers nearby. As her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she saw other figures in the room, similarly bound. There were 4 of them, a middle-aged man, 2 young women, and a teenage boy. They all looked terrified. "Help," she whispered urgently. "We have to get out of here." The man shook his head. "He'll hear you. He's always listening." Footsteps echoed from above, growing louder. The door to the basement creaked open, and a tall, shadowy figure descended the stairs. He wore a mask, his eyes cold and emotionless. "Welcome, Amanda," he said in that same gravelly voice. "I've been expecting you." The masked man walked over to the young woman and roughly untied her, dragging her upstairs despite her feeble attempts to resist. The basement door slammed shut, and Amanda could hear the girl's muffled screams. Amanda's heart pounded. She knew she had to find a way out. Amanda glanced around the room, searching for anything that could help her escape. She noticed a loose nail on the floorboards near her feet. Carefully, she maneuvered her foot to pry it loose, using her shoe to pull it closer. After what felt like an eternity, she managed to get the nail in her hand and began sawing through the ropes. The man across from her watched, hope flickering in his eyes. "Be quick," he whispered. "He won't be gone long." Amanda nodded, working as fast as she could. Finally, the ropes fell away. She quickly freed the others, and they began searching for an exit. They found a small window high on the wall, just large enough for them to squeeze through. The teenage boy went first, then the middle-aged man. Amanda helped the young woman up, then hoisted herself through the window, landing in the dirt outside. They ran through the woods, branches scratching their faces and tearing at their clothes. Behind them, they could hear the masked man shouting, his footsteps crashing through the underbrush. "Faster," Amanda urged, her breath coming in ragged gasps. They burst into a clearing and saw the lights of a farmhouse in the distance. Hope surged through them as they sprinted towards it. Suddenly, the masked man appeared in front of them, blocking their path. "You're not going anywhere," he snarled. Amanda grabbed a large branch from the ground and swung it at him with all her strength. The man stumbled, and she saw her chance. She kicked him hard in the knee, causing him to fall. The others joined in, overpowering him just long enough to escape. They ran to the farmhouse, pounding on the door. A kindly old couple answered, and Amanda quickly explained their ordeal. The police were called, and the nightmare finally seemed to be over. Days later, Amanda tried to return to a normal life, but the events of that night haunted her. She couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Paranoia set in, and she found herself constantly looking over her shoulder. One evening, as she was getting ready for bed, she noticed a piece of paper slipped under her door. Her blood ran cold as she unfolded it. "Nice try, Amanda. See you soon." The masked man. She looked out her window, her heart pounding. In the distance, she thought she saw a figure standing in the shadows, watching her. The terror returned, stronger than ever. Amanda's story spread, a chilling reminder that sometimes the nightmares we escape have a way of finding us again.
Next story.
Emily Thompson was exhausted. After hours of studying in the campus library, she decided to call it a night. It was late, well past midnight, and the campus was eerily quiet as she walked to her car. The only sound was the faint rustling of leaves in the cold autumn breeze. She had a long drive ahead of her on the desolate stretch of road leading home. As she drove through the dark, empty roads, her thoughts drifted to the upcoming exams. She barely noticed the stranded car on the side of the road until it was almost too late. Next to the car stood a man dressed as a clown, illuminated by the harsh light of her headlights. He waved frantically, signaling for help. Emily's heart pounded. Every horror movie she had ever seen screamed at her to keep driving, but her innate sense of compassion won out. She pulled over, rolling down her window just enough to hear him. "Please, can you help me?" the clown begged, his voice shaky. "My car broke down and my phone is dead. I just need a ride to the nearest gas station." Against her better judgment, Emily agreed. The clown climbed into the passenger seat, his presence immediately filling the car with an unsettling sense of dread. They drove in silence for a few minutes before Emily noticed the clown staring at her, his painted smile seeming more sinister by the second. "Thank you for stopping," the clown said, breaking the silence. His voice had a strange, almost sing-song quality to it. Not many people would. Most just drive by, too afraid or too busy to help. Emily forced a smile. "It's no problem. Everyone needs a little help sometimes." "That's true," the clown replied, his eyes never leaving her. "But kindness can be dangerous, you know. You never really know who you might be helping." Emily's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "I guess that's a risk we all take." The clown chuckled, a low, unsettling sound. "You're very brave, Emily, or maybe just very foolish." Her heart skipped a beat. "How do you know my name?" The clown tapped his nose with a gloved finger. "Oh, I have my ways. Names are such interesting things, don't you think? They hold so much power." Emily's unease grew. "What's your name?" "Names aren't important," he said, his smile widening. "But if you must call me something, you can call me Mr. Jingles." "Mr. Jingles," Emily repeated, trying to keep her voice steady. "That's an interesting name. Fitting for a clown, don't you think?" Mr. Jingles said, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. "I've always loved the circus. The excitement, the thrill, the unpredictability. You never know what might happen next." Emily glanced at the road ahead, wishing she could reach the gas station faster. "I suppose that's true. Tell me, Emily," Mr. Jingles continued, leaning closer. "Do you like the circus?" "I haven't been to one in years," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Such a shame," he said, his tone almost mocking. "The circus is a place of wonders, a place where anything can happen." Emily's heart pounded in her chest. "Why do you like the circus so much?" Mr. Jingles' smile faded slightly. "Because, Emily, the circus is a place where reality bends, where the impossible becomes possible. It's a place where people can disappear and no one will ever find them." The car filled with a tense silence, the only sound the hum of the engine. Emily's mind raced, trying to find a way to end the conversation. "You know," Mr. Jingles said softly, "sometimes people need to be reminded of the wonders of the circus, to see the magic for themselves." Before Emily could react, Mr. Jingles pulled out a small device from his pocket. It emitted a sharp, high-pitched sound. Emily's vision blurred, and darkness quickly overtook her. Emily awoke with a start, her head pounding. She found herself bound to a chair in a dimly lit room. The walls were covered in peeling circus posters, and the air smelled of mildew and decay. Panic set in as she struggled against her restraints, the realization of her predicament sinking in. The clown appeared before her, his painted grin now a menacing leer. "Welcome to my circus," he whispered, his voice dripping with malice. "You're the star of tonight's show." Emily's eyes darted around the room, looking for any means of escape. She noticed other captives, each bound and gagged, their eyes filled with terror. Among them was Sarah, a young woman who had been missing for weeks, her once bright eyes now dull with despair. The clown relished in their fear, taunting them with twisted tricks and cruel jokes. Emily knew she had to get out, but the odds seemed insurmountable. Her mind raced as she formulated a plan. She managed to loosen the ropes around her wrists, freeing herself just enough to slip out of the chair. The clown's back was turned, and Emily seized the opportunity. She crept toward a nearby door, her heart pounding in her chest. Just as she reached for the handle, it creaked loudly. The clown spun around, his eyes locking onto hers. "Trying to leave the party early," he sneered, lunging at her. Emily darted through the door, slamming it behind her. She found herself in a dark corridor, lined with old circus props and tattered curtains. The air was thick with dust, making it hard to breathe. She heard the clown's footsteps behind her, his maniacal laughter echoing through the halls. Emily ran, tears streaming down her face. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she stumbled through the dimly lit corridors. She found a small nook behind a stack of old crates and squeezed herself into the tight space, her body trembling with fear. The footsteps grew louder, closer. She clamped a hand over her mouth to stifle her sobs. The clown's voice echoed through the hall, chilling her to the bone. "Oh, Emily, come out, wherever you are. The show must go on." She squeezed her eyes shut, praying he wouldn't find her. Minutes felt like hours as she remained hidden, every creak and groan of the building making her flinch. The footsteps eventually faded, and she dared to peek out. The hallway was empty. Summoning every ounce of courage, Emily crept out of her hiding spot. She had to find a way out. She moved cautiously, her senses on high alert. The old circus was a maze of narrow passages and decaying rooms, each one more sinister than the last. She stumbled upon a small office filled with dusty papers and old telephones. Desperately, she rifled through the drawers and found a working cell phone. Her hand shook as she dialed 911, whispering urgently to the operator about her situation and the clown. The operator assured her that help was on the way. Emily knew she had to keep moving. She couldn't let the clown find her again. She crept through the halls, every shadow a potential threat. Suddenly, she heard the distant sound of sirens. Relief washed over her, but she knew she wasn't safe yet. She made her way to an exit, but the clown appeared, blocking her path. His face twisted with rage. "You can't leave," he snarled. "The show isn't over." Emily's mind raced. She grabbed a nearby proper heavy wooden cane and swung it with all her might. The clown staggered back, giving her just enough time to push past him and burst through the door. She ran through the dark, empty circus grounds, not daring to look back. The sirens grew louder, closer. She kept running until she reached the safety of the flashing lights and uniformed officers. They surrounded her, asking questions, but all she could do was point back towards the circus. The officers escorted Emily to safety, and she explained everything in a panicked rush. The police moved in on the abandoned circus, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Emily watched from a distance, her body shaking with fear and relief. The authorities stormed the abandoned circus, but the clown had vanished, leaving behind a haunting silence and the other hostages, now freed from their nightmarish ordeal. Emily was taken to safety, and a massive manhunt was launched for the deranged clown. Emily thought she was finally safe, but a lingering sense of dread haunted her. Weeks passed, and Emily tried to move on with her life. One evening, she returned home to find a package on her doorstep. She opened it to reveal a small music box. As it played a haunting tune, she noticed a note inside. "I'm always watching. See you at the next show. Your favorite clown, Mr. Jingles." Emily's blood ran cold. She knew the nightmare was far from over. The clown was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for his next performance. Thank you for joining me on this spine-chilling journey with Emily and the sinister Mr. Jingles. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more terrifying tales. Stay safe, and remember, sometimes it's better to trust your instincts and keep driving. Until next time, keep an eye on the shadows and beware the unexpected.